Good afternoon. Welcome to the Migration Policy Institute discussion on Beyond the Border, U.S. Mexico Migration Accord, the Beyond the Border, how the U.S. Mexico Migration Accord has ushered in sweeping change in Mexico in its first year. We're very pleased to have all of you with us today. We have a report that we have released today, written by my colleague Ariel Ruiz Soto, who you'll hear from in a minute, which looks at changes in Mexico that have happened as a result of the accord that happened just about a year ago between Mexico and the United States, between the two governments. We also have a phenomenal panel that will follow his remarks that includes Angela Kocherga, who's now the news director at KTEP TV in El Paso, which is the public TV and radio station in El Paso, longtime border reporter for Bello News, as well as Mexico City bureau chief and former professor at ASU at the Cronkite School. Gerónimo Gutiérrez, the former Mexican ambassador to the United States, as well as former head of the NAD Bank, former Mexican undersecretary for North America, for Latin America, and for governance. And Roberta Jacobson, Ambassador Jacobson, former U.S. ambassador to Mexico, also former assistant secretary for Western Hemisphere, someone who's held all sorts of distinguished diplomatic positions in the United States, and now at Albright Stonebridge Group. And so great to have all of you here. About a year ago, the U.S. and Mexico reached an agreement on managing migration. This was done under difficult circumstances. This has set off a series of changes in Mexican immigration policy over the past year, as well as concerns around humanitarian issues at the border. We have seen subsequent U.S. policies around the COVID epidemic and around asylum that have happened unilaterally since that period, but some of which have had a response from the Mexican government as well. We've seen changes internally in Mexico to its immigration and asylum systems, and we've seen changes in the modalities of cooperation between the two countries. And so we're going to talk, Ariel will really talk about what has happened over the past year based on his report, and then we'll have a conversation with all of the panelists about both what this means and what future paths might be in store for us. It's great to have you with us. If you would like to tweet about this, you can feel free to do so. If you want to participate in the discussion, you can actually, we will have a time for Q&A. You can go to the text box, which is on your right upper side, I believe, for most of us. And you can type a question in there. We'll answer it during the Q&A period. If you have technical difficulties or a question, you can email us at events@migrationpolicy.org or tweet at us at Migration Policy. And thank you for being with us. We look forward to a very lively and informative conversation. And let me turn first to Ariel Ruiz, Associate Policy Analyst at Migration Policy Institute, someone I've had the pleasure of working with on a number of different projects, prolific author, researcher, both on U.S. policy and U.S. Mexico, Central American migration policies. Ariel, tell us about what's happened over the past year.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to all of you joining us remotely, especially in the very difficult circumstances that we all live in. Following the months of, I'll be trying to be as brief as possible so we can have as much conversation. Following the months of the heightened Central American migration to Mexico and to the United States border, and a threat by the United States President Donald Trump to impose a tariff of up to 25% on Mexican imports, absent additional Mexican cooperation on migration, the U.S. and the Mexican government signed a migration cooperation agreement on June 7, 2019. And this agreement marked the beginning of a new era in the development of Mexican migration, as Andrew suggested, looking specifically at immigration enforcement and humanitarian protection systems. And this policy that we'll go over today and what's available online examines how the agreement and subsequent measures in the United States, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, have reshaped Mexico's response to migration in the years since this agreement was signed. So after 3 days of negotiations, the U.S. and Mexico came up with a joint declaration that contained 5 key components. First, Mexico agreed to strengthen migration controls at the Mexican-Guatemalan border, as well as in the interior, by deploying its recently created National Guard to buttress existing efforts of the National Institute of Migration, INAMI in Spanish. Second, Mexico agreed to accept more non-Mexican asylum seekers and migrants returned by the United States as part of the expansion of the migration protection protocols, also known as Remain in Mexico, across the U.S.-Mexico border, making a commitment specifically to give them access to employment, healthcare, and education opportunities while they wait for their asylum cases in the United States to be resolved. In turn, the United States committed to expediting the processing of asylum claims from these migrants in the United States, as well as working with Mexico to continue to cooperate on reducing and dismantling human smuggling networks, as well as their financial systems. Finally, both governments committed to addressing root causes of migration through development investment in southern Mexico and Central America by coordinating efforts with regional and international partners, specifically and most importantly perhaps through Mexico's Comprehensive Development Plan, Plan de Desarrollo Integral in Spanish. What you see in this figure is the Mexican enforcement since 2014 to 2020 as far as May. And what you should see is that the signing of the Cooperation-Mexican Agreement marked a substantial shift in Mexico's migration enforcement, really restructuring enforcement operations and priorities and institutional leadership in the early months of the López Obrador administration. The Mexican apprehensions of migrants were at levels similar to those in previous years at the beginning of the year, as you can see before the dotted lines, but began to increase quickly in April. And by June, when the agreement came into effect, Mexican authorities had made 31,000 apprehensions of migrants and 22,000 returns, which came to be the highest month of enforcement of June on record since at least in 2001, which is the figures we received. Figures through 2007 to September 2019, just weeks after the agreement's 90-day review period, demonstrated a dramatic increase in enforcement. Mexican migration authorities apprehended 81,000 migrants from June through September, which is a 76% increase over the 46,000 they had apprehended the same period in 2018. Migrant returns also rose by 69%, from 37,000 to 62,000 between the two periods. Nonetheless, while migrant enforcement activities increased in December 2018, they did not surpass the levels of 2015, when the Mexican authorities implemented the Southern Border Program, Programa Frontera Sur. In all of 2019, Mexico made 187,000 apprehensions of migrants and 181,000 returns. And you can see again here through the dotted lines the period that we discussed. Then Mexico's MPP program, or the US MPP program, and Mexico's increase in its arriving number of migrants really began to increase in the spring. But if you see, as you see in the figure, from June to September, just weeks after the 90-day agreement, Mexico received approximately 39,000 migrants from the United States, more than 4 times the number it received in the first 5 months. And just quickly, for those of you new to MPP, it's a program that allows migrants to be returned to Mexico while they wait for their immigration hearings in the United States. So what you can see here is that at the same time, Mexican migration authorities increase their capacity as well to be sent to receive additional migrants being sent back from about 100 people daily to about 500 in some locations. By November, MPP indeed was operational in nearly all sections of the U.S.-Mexico border. However, U.S. logistical and administrative issues in processing MPP and Mexico's limited shelter capacity have raised significant concerns about the dangerous conditions these migrants returning face while waiting in Mexico. Some migrants have found discrepancies in their notices to appear in U.S. courts. Others have not been properly notified and had administrative errors in those notices. Although the Mexican agreement established 2 shelters, one in Ciudad Juárez and another in Tijuana, most of the responsibility to provide a daily service to these migrants continues to rely on civil society shelters and organizations that have a strained capacity. In total, estimates suggest that these civil society organizations are still continuing to receive more migrants, and they are running out of funds, as was mentioned specifically with COVID in a moment. In border cities that do not have the shelter capacity, a lot of, for example, Matamoros, Tamaulipas, migrants have resorted to using and living in precarious makeshift camps that are prone to flooding and other conditions. At the same time, multiple human organizations have documented these migrants' exposure to dangerous conditions. For example, one study found that more than 20% of migrants returned to Mexico were threatened by violence, while another tracked more than 800 public reports of murder, torture, rape, kidnapping, and other violent attacks against asylum seekers and other migrants returned to Mexico. For the other elements of the agreement, it's unclear and have received mixed results. It is unclear, for example, whether the U.S. processing of asylum cases has improved significantly over the period that the agreement covered, and it is while we have received or seen gradual improvement in the dismantling of human smuggling networks, especially those of transport and buses that are smuggling migrants from southern Mexico to northern Mexico, we still don't know how widespread or how they will continue specifically in the current conditions. Also, the U.S. and Mexico have had different development assistance priorities in how they invest in Mexico, in southern Mexico and Central America, including in the United States pauses and reductions in U.S. funding that have changed just recently, and in Mexico with still unclear results of two of its main programs in terms of investment that are really made to produce more opportunities of employment for migrants that would be coming to the United States. The other part of this report looks at protection systems, and in the year of the implementation of the agreement, the U.S.-Mexican humanitarian protection system achieved some undeniable advances, but also faced significant challenges in needs of protection. First, the demand of humanitarian protection in Mexico had already been increasing since 2016, when the Mexican Refugee Commission, known as COMAR, received 9,000 asylum requests, more than the total received during the previous 2 years, as you can see in the graph. And then asylum applications doubled every year since 2017, reaching approximately 71,000 in 2019. In the first 3 months, it's notable to suggest that the first 3 months of 2020, COMAR received 17,000 applications, which represented a 34% increase over the same period in 2019, and already surpassed the numbers of applications in 2017. At the same time, and facing this additional need of protection, the Mexican Congress increased COMAR's budget, assigning 47 million pesos, which is about $2.4 million, to COMAR, which is an increase of 127% compared to 2019. COMAR also invested in increasing offices. It added another center in Tapachula, Chiapas, the southernmost point of Mexico. And it also opened offices in the northern cities of Monterrey, Nuevo León, and Tijuana, Baja California, to try to increase and address significant gaps there. To further increase its capacity, of course, it also tried to increase and is trying to increase the staffing of its center so that there can be more people able to process asylum applications. And while these were good intentions, it's still unclear whether the current conditions with COVID-19 are going to delay in some way and make it more difficult for COMAR to meet the demands of protection as it increases in the region. So perhaps one of the most important things that we discover in this report is that both the U.S. and Mexico are still adapting to changes in the Mexican or in the virus pandemic, and specifically Mexico will continue to work with the United States. One evidence of this is that when the United States implemented a CDC rule known as Title 42, Mexico that basically allows or impedes migrants to enter the United States and returns them to Mexico. Mexico accepted to receive an additional number of migrants, and by the end of April 2020, U.S. Border Patrol had already expelled more than 20,000 migrants, and the majority of them to Mexico. And in May, the Trump administration extended this policy indefinitely. At the same time, protests and critiques of the health precautions in detention centers and other places that are helping and servicing migrants grew dramatically in the spring of this year. And as these actions increased, more of them also the Mexican government tried to release some pressures by working with migrant organizations and releasing most of its migrants from the detention centers that it had. The latest figures we have is that about 200 migrants continue to be detained in these conditions, and that they're doing better to try to continue these agreements. Perhaps one last point on this to try to give a summary of this is that at the same time the COVID pandemic affected the humanitarian conditions, it also made it more difficult for Mexico to apprehend and report or return migrants to the regions because of the different restrictions on mobility and other policies that limited movement, specifically with Guatemala. And as you may have heard, this led to some points where migrants were left without protection on the southern border. So the takeaways points of at least that I wanted to try to stress for this conversation is that increased enforcement and demand for asylum in Mexico have exposed significant weaknesses in the systems to manage migration and protect vulnerable populations over the last year after the agreement. At the same time, that without additional capacity and infrastructure, Returning large numbers of migrants may exacerbate some of the serious challenges of Mexican border communities, and really Mexicans as well living in these communities face. And finally, that thinking more forward about this, Mexicans' modernization efforts will ultimately depend on having a balance of migration enforcement and human protection capacities in face of future pressures from the United States. This is something that we can expect to continue to see, and that we at MPI are going to continue to follow very closely to try to determine what the effect in the coming years will be. With that, I will pass it back to Andrew.
Thank you, Ariel. That's great. And we will turn now to our panel to discuss this, to talk about what this looks like on the ground in the diplomatic relationship. And we'll go first to Angela Kocherga, who is news director at KTEP, the public radio station in El Paso, as well as directing Border Design, which I recommend to all of you, by the way, at UTEP magazine, and as well as many other things, and a former winner of the Maria Moore's Cabot Prize as well. So, Angela, what does this look like as you report from this on the border?
Well, first of all, thank you, Andrew, and the Migration Policy Institute, and of course, Ariel, that very insightful report. A year later, I just can't believe how much has happened. I'm also very honored to be included in this conversation with Ambassador Roberta Jacobson and Ambassador Gerónimo Gutiérrez. I honor both of you and look forward to hearing your comments. I've been invited to give you kind of the view from the ground, from the border. I'm here in El Paso, Juárez, the Paso del Norte region. So greetings from the border. Saludos desde la frontera norte or sur, depending on where you're looking at it. I've been reporting on these issues for many years, and it's been astounding, and I'm sure for you. You know, we used to look at these trends year to year or even over decades. Now we're looking at things month to month, week to week, day sometimes. Nowhere have we seen the impact of these policies more directly than right here on the border on both sides. And just to give you a sense, it was exactly a year ago I was reporting in Ciudad Juárez as that National Guard force was deployed by President López Obrador to both of Mexico's borders. Here we saw immediately a dramatic impact. I saw something I never imagined I'd witnessed. I saw migrants, Central American migrants, parents and children trying to sneak out of Mexico, trying to evade the National Guard and run to the Border Patrol on the other side of Rio Grande up to the fence so they could turn themselves in and ask for asylum. So really it's kind of a reversal of roles. The Trump administration has wanted a wall, and we do have a barrier along big stretches of the border. But what we really saw that was effective was Mexico taking action in an enforcement role, and that human wall of the National Guard along this stretch of border, really deterring people, Central Americans, from trying to reach the U.S., at least temporarily. Some people got pushed to more remote stretches of border, more risky routes, and of course that also benefited organized crime that moves people up and down the border. So that was astounding. This is so complex, and there were so many impacts. I thought I'd figure out a way to kind of tell you through one example of the evolution of the migration policy impact here on the border. Many of you might be familiar with Annunciation House. It's a nonprofit organization based in El Paso, been here for decades, run by Ruiz, and he calls hospitality centers. They're temporary shelters for migrants who come through here on the way, usually while they're waiting for their immigration. They stop here on the way to the cities where they have relatives. Annunciation has been around for a long time, dates back to the 80s when the original refugees that were served were coming from Central America, from countries where there was civil war. Most recently, the influx was Central American parents and children looking for asylum. And just in the last year and a little bit more, Ruben has had to, an Annunciation House, adapt in remarkable ways very quickly. First, from individual migrants, adults, to handle family units, families, parents, and children. Then the numbers became so large, Ruben had to reach out to other faith-based organizations. Annunciation House partnered with in the whole region to receive these families temporarily. Eventually, the numbers became so large that Annunciation House opened a temporary, what they call a respite center, hospitality center in a warehouse that was converted to receive families, again, temporarily coming through here on the way to U.S. cities where they would wait out their immigration hearings. With MP, the remain in Mexico or return to Mexico, and the National Guard, the flow almost from one day to the next dropped dramatically, and the number of people coming into the U.S. and at least needing some sort of shelter went down to very low numbers. Then Ruben and Annunciation House reached out to Mexican shelters and Mexican authorities to see how they could partner and help people who are now stuck in Mexico. And so that was the adapting there. And Mexican shelters, nonprofits, have really done a remarkable job with limited resources, as Ariel pointed out. Local communities trying to do the best they can. A lot of them faith-based, like Casa del Migrante. And of course, we do have a government shelter, government finance shelter in Juarez that has been essential to deal with the sheer numbers of people coming through. The pandemic has created new pressures. We see now there's a hotel set up, what they call it's the Hotel Flamingo, but you don't go there for a vacation. You're there if you're a migrant arriving and need to be quarantined, migrant families for 2 weeks. Sure that you're able to go on to one of the other shelters, that you're not going to be carrying the virus. There have been some minor outbreaks in shelters here, and real concern on the part of health authorities in Ciudad Juarez that there could be as the health authority here put it, an explosive outbreak if this spreads in some of these overcrowded shelters. I would say Ruben, final evolution has been to adapt Annunciation House to have protocols for migrants who are released from ICE detention who need, after they've been able to convince. There have been big fights, as many of you know, with lawyers trying to get medically vulnerable migrants released from ICE detention centers. A few are released, and in order to ensure that that they're safe and that they're not passing on whatever they may have been exposed to in terms of the virus to other people around the country, there are isolation areas in Annunciation House, medical personnel, and so the migrants are quarantined for 2 weeks, and are deemed safe enough to travel to other parts of the U.S. To await their immigration hearings. But really, at this point, the humanitarian and pandemic crisis has converged to create some real pressures, a pressure cooker situation, I'd say, for especially Mexico, where the bulk of migrants are stuck. And dealing with the economic downturn, the health situation, and some of the organized crime targeting of migrants that Ariel documented in his report that we all have heard about. And I've interviewed people who've been in those kidnapping or ransom situations where they're held until their family member in the U.S. can pay that ransom. I think that our big questions going forward for researchers and reporters are to track the migration, what has happened to many of the migrants. Some have gone home. They've told me, we don't have a support system in Juarez. We're parents of young children. We can't be working. We have nowhere for our children. It's a very risky situation safety-wise. So some have gone home. Others said we can't go home. They stayed, especially the Cubans. And they've really been resilient in building their own communities and businesses. And there's a lot of great Cuban restaurants in Juarez now, for those of you who visit. So we're seeing that, and they're staying and making a home, and probably not, they seem as concerned about reaching the U.S. right now. And then finally, we have to figure out what has happened that disappeared. So that will be our big challenge in the near future. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Angela. That was great. We'll turn now to Ambassador Gerónimo Gutiérrez. He represented Mexico as ambassador in Washington for a number of years, as well as president of the NADBank, director general of the NADBank, and a number of senior positions in the Mexican government before coming to the United States. Gerónimo, great to have you with us. What does this look like in the past year?
Thank you very much, Andrew. I also want to congratulate Ariel for a wonderful work and a very good paper. And it's a pleasure to be with Angela and Ambassador Jacobson, as always. I really have looked forward to this occasion. So let me first start with the obvious, but I think that we must recognize that U.S. and Mexico migration policy will never be the same. But nevertheless, we do have, I think, both countries have a vested interest in trying to work and cooperate as much as possible. And that is much more easier said than done. And I think we have to recognize that. And I think we have to recognize that the situation we're in, and that started basically, 2000. We had a peak in 2014, 15 in terms of the regional migration phenomenon, and then again 2017, 18, 19, and it's it has been very difficult. It's not I don't think it's a place where we want to remain too long. I think it's a relatively patched up solution to a very complex phenomenon. But in spite of those difficulties, I think we need to try to work together. And I'm not being diplomatic. I'm no longer serving, but I just think that it really makes sense to to be careful and to try to address it at work. And again, it'll never be easy. The second thing I want to emphasize is what this situation has shown is that both the Mexican and the U.S. asylum system have been surpassed by reality, and therefore they need to be fixed. And I don't pretend to know how to best fix the U.S. asylum system, and probably neither the Mexican, but I do think that there needs to be a thoughtful discussion on the asylum systems of both countries, and then especially working in it on the regional context. And I think that's one of the tasks that we have for the future. I also want to emphasize that even though both countries are working together to address the root causes of migration, especially from Central America and Mexico, and that's certainly good. And it's not a new idea. The López Obrador administration, I think, took the right decision in stressing this point and brought a renewed interest in working with the United States and the Central Americans. And I think that's very positive. I think there's a very large gap in terms of what has been accomplished so far, and the traction of those initiatives versus the sort of the level of the challenge. And I do hope that working with the Central Americans and other, perhaps also regionally, that the U.S. and the Mexican governments continue to work there. And again, it's much more easier said than done. It's not a new paradigm, by the way. I don't think that, and I think we need to think carefully about why has it been so difficult to address these root causes, especially on the Central American Northern Triangle countries, because it's not new, and several, I think, smart and careful people and institutions have been trying to work at that for a long period of time. And the U.S. has had previous initiatives in previous administrations, and Mexico likewise. And we haven't really been able, being self-critical, to, do enough. And therefore, I think that it's warranted to think what can truly be accomplished, and what is the best way to go and do that. I think that the other thing is that we need to find a way to differentiate, or better ways to differentiate what is economic migration from actually asylum, legitimate asylum seeking. And I think part of the problem in the recent years has been precisely that. And I'm sure it's not, it's difficult, but those are two distinct phenomena. And I think that unless that is recognized and addressed separately with solutions on both sides, we will continue to have this very difficult dynamic. I also think that Mexico, two more things on Mexico is we need to have, Mexico must have a very honest and thoughtful discussion about enforcement. And what exactly does it mean? I think, Ariel, one of your main takeaways is, you cannot have these two views, one that sees migration as an absolute universal right, as many people in Mexico do, and perhaps elsewhere also in the United States, and then as the sovereign right of any country to determine who comes in, how they do it, for how long, and just those poles, we need to narrow that gap. And I think that this has been a game changer, and certainly the AMLO administration has been, very bold and criticized for it, but for using actually the National Guard to deter immigration. I think that's a situation where we don't want to remain, certainly. But I do feel that in my country, there's a need to discuss what are the parameters by which you actually do sensible humanitarian enforcement, operational control of borders, while at the same time being able to be absolutely, respectful of human rights and sensitive to the fact that there is a grave humanitarian situation going on. And I don't pretend to say that, Cici. Having served in previous administrations in these in topics related to these, or very much involved, I think to be honest, if not fail, we certainly came very short of finding solutions to those problems. And I think that needs to be there. Mexico, one of the things that worries me is that we're always, in the bilateral relation, and I can talk about Mexico itself, we're always trying to, we're always lagging behind in terms of the solution. We need to, I think, whatever we do needs to be sustainable. There's a risk that if we don't think about this in a sustainable way, we can again find ourselves, in a similar situation, relatively, in a relatively short period of time. And I think that the sustainability of a new migration policy depends on 2 or 3 factors. Number one, money, money, and money. If Mexico is so proud about being a country, and I think we are, of destiny, of, for migrants, of transit, and also of origin, we need to put our, mouth where the, our money where the mouth is, and try to really devote, significant resources to addressing this. And we have not done enough. And I think that's a problem. The other one is we need I think that it will be positive to have a international organization sort of accompany this process of building a stronger institutional framework and sort of a medium to long-term immigration policy. I think that one specific recommendation is to have Mexico do a special migration program in terms of its own planning law, which has been done in the past, and have an international organization, or several, whether it's the Organization of International Migrations, the IDB, or some other forms, be participant. So it becomes, there's a follow-up, and there's accountability, and there's sustainability in whatever we do. And I think that's very relevant. The final point I want to make, one is we should look, we should take a closer look also about, what people have in Mexico, what their views are on migration, because we tend to be very vocal in favor of migrants, and that's, something that, we can feel proud of. But at the same time, if you look at some of the recent polls, Mexico, the average Mexican is not so thrilled anymore about having people go through Mexico. And I don't pretend to be judgmental about that. I just think that we're sometimes we're not realistic about how to deal with our own challenges on migration. Again, albeit that is a very difficult challenge. So, and certainly COVID-19 is going to change everything, in the sense that we don't know exactly. I mean, there are a lot of risks, and that's why, as Ariel and Angela were talking, people have been released, because it's extremely dangerous to have them in any form of detention. And whether there will be a true inflection point, a result of what has happened, and COVID-19, enough to dent the regional migration phenomenon in the coming years, I don't know. But I think that's a question we also need to address, because we don't want to be building some policy based upon, ex post, and certainly, a year or 2 years from now, think that, have things change and not be all that up to date with respect to that policy. I know this is, I'll stop there, thanking again for the opportunity, and congratulating Ariel, the Migration Policy Institute, on this wonderful work. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerónimo. We now turn to Roberta Jacobson, Ambassador Roberta Jacobson, who was a fountain of wisdom and a steady hand in the U.S. Mexico relationship for, I think, about 20 years, Roberta, and a person that really had deep trust among people on both sides of the border. Roberta, you former ambassador to Mexico, of course, but also former assistant secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs and many other roles in the U.S. government. Roberta, give us your thoughts on this.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you everybody who's gone before. I'm going to try and be really brief because the smartest people have already talked, and the report is excellent, Ariel. Thank you so much for that. 2 or 3 brief comments on Ariel's report from the U.S. policy side, and then some additional thoughts. First, let me say that I think Ariel has pointed out absolutely correctly that what the commitments were by both governments when they went into this. Some of those have been a lot more visible than others. But it seems to me that as he outlines what some of the U.S. commitments were, in particular, expedition of asylum, expediting the asylum process on the U.S. side, which I can only say does not appear to be happening. Angela may know that better, but it certainly appears to me that the U.S. has neither the resources devoted to it, nor frankly the will devoted to expediting asylum processes to actually live up to that commitment. And second of all, it seems to me that the whole notion of dismantling the human smuggling rings, which I think is critically important to this, it's great that action is being taken perhaps against some who are transporting those migrants, but to me that is a marginal part of this problem. It is not the fundamental criminal networks. It is a part of it, and you have to take a holistic approach, but it's far from getting to the criminal element that's at the heart of the exploitation of migrants. Let me also say that on the asylum processing, one of the things that I think is critical to remember from the U.S. side is that the United States closed off almost every other avenue for migration from Central America and indeed from Mexico to the United States, which in some respects, not completely, forced people to seek asylum, right? There aren't temporary worker programs other than agricultural and low-skilled, H-2A, and those have struggled, frankly, to keep up with both demand and processing. And so people have sort of resorted to requesting asylum, both for legitimate reasons, but also because they don't know of any other way to get to the United States, and the closing down of family reunification is obviously a critical part of that. But I also think that it's important that we look at the implications of some of these policies on both the U.S. and on Mexico. If you're going to devote 10,000, 20,000 of your brand new Guardia Nacional to migration policy, it strikes me that you better have your security situation under firm control, and that's exactly the opposite of what we're seeing in Mexico. Why are these security forces devoting their attention to migration when the homicide rate and other indicators of crime in Mexico have exploded? Again, that underscores, I think, will this policy be sustainable over the long term if and when, because I suspect they will, numbers rise again? Do we go back to threats of tariffs or trade wars, which I think really is the only reason that Mexico agreed to the Remain in Mexico policy initially? A couple of other thoughts outside the paper on the U.S. side. First, I think as we approach the 2020 presidential election in the United States, it is an excruciatingly difficult balancing act for any presidential candidate. Perhaps any presidential candidate who isn't President Trump, but I'll leave that aside. And that is, how do you signal a more humane, a more balanced policy without signaling that people should be prepared to come immediately after Inauguration Day? And that is problematic, I think, for Democratic candidates in general. And so any transition away from what I see as highly draconian policies on the U.S. side, I think will probably have to be done slowly to unwind them, because otherwise there is a tendency to see this rush to the border, which unfortunately, again, will kick up backlash. But the second thing I think is important to connect the COVID-19 pandemic and migration policy, because it is being used as an excuse to implement certain even more extreme migration crackdowns on the basis of public health. That's certainly what we've seen. Ariel points out the extension of Title 42, the CDC rule, ad infinitum, or indefinitely at this point. It is being implemented for public health reasons, which probably could have been defined more narrowly, was to be in place, I think, till June 22nd. Now that's indefinite. And that is because it is something that the administration would have liked to do anyway. Finally, I will say the unsustainability on the Mexican side for reasons of security, as well as, I think, political reasons, mean that at some point, these kinds of U.S. policies will come a cropper, I think, with Mexico. And the extent of that cooperative relationship will be tested very severely. And I guess I can only hope that they are tested in a period when the countries are growing economically again and when their COVID-19 virus has receded a little bit, so that more sort of rational policymaking can take over. I'll stop there. Thank you, Andrew, very much.
Thank you, Roberta. That was great. Let me let's turn now to questions. We've already gotten a number of questions, so feel free if you want to jump into the Q&A. You can type into the chat area and the Q&A area on the right upper side of your screen. Let me read the questions we've had for now, and we will go to the panelists to get their responses. One is, what are we seeing in terms of COVID-19 infection rates in border communities, given the expulsions to the border communities from the United States? Is there U.S. Mexico cooperation on dealing with COVID-19 in the border region? How is the comprehensive development plan being implemented by both the Mexico and U.S. governments? This is the plan that was developed at the instigation of the Mexican government early in López Obrador's administration. And there's another question on how Mexico is dealing with the expulsions in general. What measures are in place to take people in who are expelled, which is different from MPP, right? There are two channels. There are really three channels of people, right? There are people waiting in MPP. There are people being expelled back to Mexico who are not Mexican or from different regions of Mexico or from Central America. And then obviously you have people who are metering, who are also waiting for an asylum hearing, probably to be turned away or put in MPP. So at least three streams of people waiting in border communities right now. Let's start with those. Has Mexico received, here's a question. Has Mexico received any monies related to the MPP agreement? Is there money that changed hands? And to what extent has the compatibility of nationalist policies on either side of the border allowed for this agreement? How would Mexico react to change in U.S. migration policy? And thanks to Ambassador Jacobson from Teresa Brown for raising the issue of what a new administration could do to amend current policies. Let's go back to the panelists, and let's go in the order we had. Ariel, let's start with you, and we'll go through the panelists in order.
Sure. I think I can. There's some questions that I don't know immediately the answers to. I think there's not a lot of information on this, but I can shed a couple of points. The first one that I think should be made more clear is what happens under the Title 42 expulsions to Mexico. And so when somebody is expelled from the United States to Mexico, what happens, at least as far as we know, is that migrant is given an opportunity in Mexico to either stay there if they've had a previous legal status in Mexico, for example, if they had previously received asylum there, or they're allowed, or they have the opportunity to request asylum in Mexico like everybody else does, which would take, in this period of COVID-19, with everything that's slowing down, would take a number of months. And then finally, they're also offered an opportunity to be returned voluntarily to their countries of origin. It is, at least according to some of the media reports that we've seen, most of the people who are being expelled are actually choosing to be returned voluntarily to their countries of origin. Again, it's not a clear process, and we still would want to know more about how or who is being expelled from the United States, who is being chosen to be expelled by the U.S. But the clear factor here is that Mexican immigration authorities are trying to understand and have these three options for migrants, at the same time as some of these migrants who may be choosing to stay in Mexico for the short or longer period of time will be continuing to face limited resources on Mexico's northern border and in the interior, in Mexico City, I think there has been some movements and some organizations and city efforts to address more migrants there have been successful. But the reality of this too is that not all migrants are going to Mexico City, and in fact, some of them may have less access to services and resources if they're going to their states that are not as better as equipped to do that. And then just briefly on the comprehensive development plan, it is something that the Mexican government has saw as one of its main components to solve the issue of migration, or to at least try to reduce it. But so far, there are only 2 programs that the Mexican government has engaged with Central America specifically on this. One of them, and they fall under this plan. One of them is a Sembrando Vidas, which is a plan to try to increase employment in agricultural settings in Mexico, or in the countries of origin, that actually started with a similar program in Mexico. And the second program that is meant to help and increase employment among youth who would otherwise be perhaps inclined to migrate to the United States. Those are 2 programs. They have seen some significant, at least some funding from the Mexican government, but we still don't know enough about the results to verify that they're being successful at that time. And in the larger picture, what other programs the Mexican government, in addition and in cooperation with the United States, how they can continue to build on these 2 points. So I'll pass the other questions to the other panelists.
Great. Angela.
I would say that as I can comment on the COVID cross-border cooperation, I did a story a few weeks ago on contact tracing across borders. We have very close-knit border communities, and we have in El Paso and Juarez, authorities work together to contact trace. The border is closed to all essential travel. And for us, though, that there are a lot of essential people going back and forth. People have relatives on both sides, whether they're, elderly parents in Mexico or, children. People work and do essential jobs on both sides of the border. And so we still have significant people going back and forth. And so contact tracing is happening. When there have been multiple cases in El Paso. People also have been in contact with visited friends and family in Juarez, and people have ended up hospitalized here. They've had to reach out to those other relatives and coworkers because, people living and working in very, very close quarters. So that's happening. But the challenge is that, these governments that like to tout their close cooperation on the local level now have to deal with multiple, states. And we're in a region where 3 states, Texas, New Mexico, and Chihuahua. And, of course, the federal governments and their differing approaches to, first of all, shutting down the shelter in place. Mexico was a lot slower than the U.S. and then reopening. Texas has virtually opened everything now, and so you've got people going back and forth. So that is a challenge and a hazard, and so trying to figure out how to handle that when you have people going back and forth with these very close connections.
Thank you, Angela. Gerónimo, and we also have a question. Let me throw in also, if Gerónimo and Roberta want to answer it, from Gustavo Moar, who is great expert in Mexico on migration, as well as a board member of FBI. Gustavo, great to have you here. Is what will COVID-19 change in U.S. immigration policy? Will it change things on temporary workers, for example, or on legal border crossings, on legal transit across the U.S. Mexico border, or anything else? So, Gerónimo.
Bert, there's a lot of topics, so I'll try to just address some of them. On the development side, I would just think that first, again, both the U.S. Mexico need to recognize, I think, what we're really capable of helping the Central American countries. I think that's key, that whatever we are realistic about. The question was, how is it being implemented? The short answer is, I'm not sure, but I think that there's sort of some happy accounting going on, and that there is actually not much more implementation going on. And I am being a bit critical right now. And I want to say, I know this is not easy to implement because I've been a part of previous effort and I can be criticized for those. But I think it's very important to be realistic. I don't think that neither the United States or Mexico can actually help more the Central American countries than they are able to help themselves. And this might sound a bit unsensitive. It's not. It's just that I think that is a reality, and I think it calls upon everybody not to be very careful about not selling hopes that are just simply not there. I think that the U.S. has the now Development Finance Corporation as the main tool, and it's very important to understand what that can accomplish and what it cannot accomplish. And it's a very useful tool in my view, but it's not a panacea, and it won't fit every kind of problem. And I think that Mexico needs, so far, as Ariel was mentioning, we've used, we used what used to be the old Fondo Yucatan, which was $100 million centered on infrastructure, and now it's going to be 3 programs. And I don't have any element to judge whether that is working or not. Personally, I don't like that idea because I think that you're using a fund that was essentially for infrastructure to serve current expenditure. And I don't think that's sustainable, and I don't think that's a good idea. And again, we don't have any results yet, so I may be wrong. But that is relatively limited. And after COVID-19, I think that there's very traction actually going on with the Central American governments between the U.S. and Mexico, and all of them as a group. I think that's just understandable. We're living in a very difficult situation, but I do hope that things pick up after that. On Gustavo's point, and also not to take much of the time, I don't know the answer. Roberta can probably say much more what's going to happen in terms of immigration policy, but I do think that there's an opportunity for Mexico. And and depends how Mexico wants to play it. But I do think that given the fact that the numbers in general were from Mexican migration were coming down, the trend line, at least in the year 2000, to a very much more manageable number politically and operationally, the question Mexico must ask is, in my view, what are we willing to, do with the United States to get a better treatment in immigration? Do we want some special treatment? And that brings the whole discussion in which you, Gustavo, were involved with the whole enchilada and the like. And I think we have to stay away from that discussion, but just a much more pragmatic approach, saying if the Mexican numbers are down, and that continues to be the case, and it might be a big if, and if we are working on so many other things, can we, sort of look to get we don't have a cap on the H-2As, but can we make those better? Can we work on the list of the TM visas as to improve them? Do we want, and from a Mexican perspective, in my view, there's an opportunity to do that right now. And that's where I would focus efforts. Again, it's an opportunity. It's going to be very complex because it's somehow linked to the fact of the same phenomenon is happening on the supply chains. Can Mexico take advantage of the fact that we're the U.S., neighbor of the U.S.? And I don't want to be, exploit the current situation, but we might find that there are some opportunities for Mexico because of our geographical position and a specific trading position. And the question is, do we want to use those or not, or try to go through that avenue? Thank you.
Thank you, Gerónimo. And we'll now turn to Roberta. And Roberta, I'm going to throw one more question at you. In addition to the entire future of U.S. immigration policy, but a recent Ipsos poll from Francisco de la Lama, a recent Ipsos poll shows that immigration is no longer considered as one of the most important problems facing America. Only 6% think so. Do you think that immigration will become a topic in this election cycle as it was in 2016?
Okay, thank you, Andrew. I'll try and be quick. Thanks for aggregating questions. I'm only going to answer a couple, obviously. First of all, I think it's just somebody asked about whether we know of any U.S. Mexico anti-COVID-19 cooperative efforts. I don't know of any. At the border, there may be an awareness of some at the local and state level. I don't know of national level, other than this donation of ventilators, which I guess came to pass, but otherwise I don't know of any other cooperative efforts. Which I do think is a marked distinction between what we saw during H1N1 and other cooperative North American efforts. Second of all, on Gustavo's point about COVID-19 and a change in U.S. immigration policy, I have to say I'm a little bit divided. I'm a little schizophrenic on this, in that on the one hand, I think the poll numbers that were just cited about immigration not being the most important issue are absolutely accurate. And I think there had been a natural progression towards something I saw as being very likely to favor immigration reform in the United States over the last couple of years. But if you get to the election and you've still got potentially close to 20% unemployment in the United States, it's very easy political fodder for President Trump or others to say, we certainly can't do that now while we have all these unemployed in the United States, even if they're not necessarily going for the same job. So I think it's going to be difficult to see whether the whole COVID crisis sort of exacerbates that or makes it clear that as people go back to work, we need this sector of jobs filled by immigrants. So it's really unclear. I do want to say something about the Central America situation. One of the things that I think most impedes success in development programs in Central America by the U.S. or anyone else is the inability, the unwillingness of those countries to really work cooperatively with each other, to work collectively, to be seen economically as a region instead of 1, 4, or 5 or whatever million person country. And I think that no matter who implements policy aid programs in those countries, whether it's United States or Mexico, unless the commitment to work cooperatively is implemented and respected, committed to by the countries on a regular basis, then it's not worth throwing the money there. But I also will say that the money that originally had begun under the Obama administration, number one, had not nearly enough time to see if it could make much difference. We do know that some of it made differences in some areas of countries. And second of all, the suspension, this starting and stopping by the Trump administration is disastrous. So it's really impossible to know how much that cooperation might have made more of a difference, but it has to start with a commitment to transparency and anti-corruption and collective action among especially the Northern Triangle countries.
Great. Thank you, Roberta. We are really at the end of our hour. I know we could go on, and there's been some additional questions. I'm going to answer just one because it came in on any specific protections for unaccompanied children who are being expelled to Mexico from Marcia Griffin. In theory, unaccompanied children are not being expelled to Mexico. The understanding is they are not. In reality, what we do know is that children who claim to be with groups sometimes are sent back and are technically unaccompanied minors. They are not with immediate family members, and there does not seem to be any specific provision for that, right? I mean, it's a much lower standard than what existed in deciding who is an unaccompanied minor at another point, and that is a problem that really needs to be addressed. That's a major issue at this moment. That is a vulnerability for unaccompanied minors. I would go back to the group, but we are out of time. This was a fabulous discussion. Ariel, congratulations on the report. Thank you for putting that out there. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, to Roberta, Gerónimo, to Angela. Yeah, really a great discussion, and I wish we could have another hour with you guys, but I know you all have busy schedules and other things to do. And thank you to the 350 people that joined us for this conversation today. Take care.
Thank you very much.